In the late 1920s, Harlan County produced 15.2 million tons of coal a year, a quarter of all of Kentucky's output. Miners here were paid 42% less than miners in unionized Illinois in 1922. A county with no major city built one of the deadliest labor wars in American history, and the fighting lasted nearly a decade. Today, fewer than 1,700 people live in a town that once anchored a county of 75,000. This is the rise and fall of America's bloody coal town, and it all starts with one railroad cutting through the Cumberland Mountains. Harlan County began as a distant outpost in the Cumberland Mountains, carved from Knox County by the Kentucky General Assembly on January 28, 1819. Early families like Samuel and Chloe Howard settled along the Clover Fork, where steep ridges and narrow hollows made travel difficult and kept the outside world at bay. The first town, named Mount Pleasant, took its name from a nearby Indian mound and was formally incorporated in 1884. For nearly a century, the settlement remained small and isolated, its growth limited by the rugged terrain and the absence of any major roads or rail lines. Black Mountain, rising to 4,145 feet just west of the county seat, dominates the landscape and stands as Kentucky's highest point. The town itself sits where the Clover Fork meets the Cumberland River, a confluence that shaped both its geography and its fate. In 1912, as the outside world began to take notice of the region's coal seams, the town was renamed Harlan to honor Major Silas Harlan, a Revolutionary War officer who died at the Battle of Blue Licks. But for generations, remoteness defined daily life here. No real infrastructure, no easy way in or out, and no hint yet of the upheaval that would arrive with the railroad. The arrival of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad in July 1911 ended Harlan's long isolation almost overnight. Within weeks, the first trainloads of coal began rolling out of the county, linking these remote Appalachian seams to steel mills and power plants hundreds of miles away. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. By the late 1920s, Harlan County mines were shipping 15.2 million tons of coal a year, about a quarter of all coal produced in Kentucky at the time. The town's population, just 557 in 1910, soared past 4,000 by 1930. Newcomers poured in from across the region and beyond, drawn by the promise of steady work and the lure of high wages. The landscape changed rapidly. Where there had been only scattered farms and forest, now stood rows of new houses, bustling rail yards, and the constant churn of mine operations. Outside capital, not local families, set the pace and scale of this transformation. Harlan's fate was now bound to the railroad's steel tracks and the relentless national demand for coal. Coal companies in Harlan did not simply extract resources from the land. They built entire towns from the ground up, shaping every aspect of daily life. Miners and their families lived in company-owned houses, their rent deducted directly from wages. Instead of cash, most pay arrived in the form of scrip, a private currency valid only within the company's own stores. There, basic goods like flour or boots routinely cost 30% more than in neighboring towns, as confirmed by a 1919 Allison Company memo and the oral histories of miners' families. The company store was often the only place to buy food or clothing, and the price difference kept workers in a cycle of debt. Operators held the power to evict families at any time, even in the middle of winter, for missed rent or for speaking out. In 1922, government records show Harlan miners earned 18 cents an hour, about 39% less than the 25 cents paid to unionized miners in Illinois. Economic dependence ran deep, and the promise of steady work masked a system designed to keep miners under the company's control long before open conflict erupted. Sheriff John Henry Blair stepped into office in 1930 with the full support of Harlan County's coal operators behind him. His name quickly became synonymous with the enforcement arm of the coal companies, a man whose authority rested as much on the payrolls of mine owners as on the law. Blair's tenure was defined by his willingness to deputize armed men, many with no law enforcement background, and grant them sweeping power to patrol the hollows and mining camps. These deputies, widely known as gun thugs, were tasked with breaking strikes, intimidating union sympathizers, and escorting non-union labor through picket lines. Violence was not an accident of the system, but a tool sharpened by Blair's office. Reports from the early 1930s describe raids on the homes of suspected organizers, midnight arrests, and the open carrying of rifles by deputies in the streets of Benham, Lynch, and Harlan. The threat of force hung over every attempt at unionizing, and testimony from miners' families and oral histories speaks of constant fear, windows shattered by gunfire, families forced to flee at night, and church meetings broken up by armed men acting under Blair's orders. Unlike neighboring West Virginia, where the United Mine Workers of America had established a strong presence, Harlan remained a place where Union men risked their lives simply by gathering. Blair's approach left little room for negotiation. The coal company's grip on the sheriff's office meant that any challenge to the company order was met not with compromise, but with the barrel of a gun. In this climate, labor conflict in Harlan County became a contest of force, setting the stage for a decade defined by bloodshed and resistance. On February 16, 1931, the Harlan County Coal Operators Association announced a 10% wage cut for miners. Paychecks that were already among the lowest in the region shrank further, fueling outrage across the coal camps. Within weeks, miners organized mass walkouts and strikes, setting off a chain of violence that would define the decade. The first major bloodshed came on May 5, 1931, outside the small town of Evarts. That morning, a convoy of company men and deputies attempted to move a non-union miner's belongings through a crowd of strikers. Gunfire erupted. When it ended, 3 company men and 1 striker lay dead. The Battle of Evarts became a national headline, and the conflict in Harlan County escalated into open warfare. Over the next several years, the Kentucky National Guard was deployed more than 6 times to enforce order, patrol the roads, and protect company property. Yet each intervention brought only temporary calm. Violence flared again and again at picket lines and mining camps and along the narrow mountain roads. Writers and activists from across the country took notice. In late 1931, the novelist Theodore Dreiser led a committee of journalists, labor leaders, and academics to Harlan. Their investigation produced the report Harlan Miners Speak, Report on Terrorism in the Kentucky Coal Fields, which documented sworn testimony from miners' families about midnight raids, evictions, and shootings. The report circulated widely, exposing the depth of the crisis and the methods used to suppress union activity. Amid the violence, cultural resistance took root. Aunt Molly Jackson, a widow and folk singer, wrote protest songs after losing her husband to black lung disease. Florence Reese, whose husband Sam was a union organizer, composed the song Which Side Are You On? After deputies raided her home in search of union literature. These songs, passed from camp to camp, became anthems of survival and defiance. By the end of the 1930s, at least 13 miners and 5 mine guards had been killed in the conflict. Hundreds more were wounded or jailed. The cycle of violence only began to slow after the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933, which briefly protected workers' right to organize, and the Wagner Act of 1935, which finally gave federal backing to unionization. But the scars of the Harlan County War, its death toll, its songs of protest, and its legacy of struggle would endure for generations. World War II transformed Harlan County into a vital artery for the nation's war machine. As factories ramped up production and the demand for energy soared, coal from these Appalachian seams became more valuable than ever. Mines that had once echoed with the sounds of strikes and gunfire now ran day and night. For the first time in decades, nearly every able-bodied man could find work underground. By 1950, Harlan's mining workforce reached its all-time high, 13,619 jobs, a number unmatched in county history. Coal trains left the valley loaded, sometimes dozens a day, feeding steel mills and power plants from Chicago to the Atlantic coast. In those years, Harlan ranked among the most productive coal counties in the United States. Paychecks, though modest, arrived regularly, and the company towns that once seemed so oppressive now bustled with activity. Schools filled, churches held standing room crowds, and local businesses thrived on the steady churn of miners' wages. Yet beneath this prosperity, the county's fate remained tied to forces far beyond its control, forces that would soon shift again, leaving scars that still linger. By the summer of 1973, the old tensions that once defined Harlan County returned, this time under a new corporate flag. The Brookside mine, operated by Eastover Coal, a subsidiary of Duke Power, became the epicenter of a 13-month standoff that would echo the violence and defiance of the 1930s. When Eastover refused to recognize the United Mine Workers of America as the bargaining agent for its miners, workers walked out. Picket lines formed along the narrow roads, and the strike quickly spread beyond the gates of Brookside, drawing in miners' families and entire communities. Lawrence Jones, a 23-year-old union supporter, stood on the front lines. On August 24, 1974, he was shot and killed by mine supervisor Billy Bruner during a confrontation near the picket line. Jones's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was the flashpoint in a year marked by escalating threats, gunfire, and intimidation. Over the course of the strike, 90 arrests were made and dozens of violent incidents were recorded. Some involved homemade weapons, others carried out by armed guards hired by the company. The sense of siege was palpable, and the grief that followed Jones's killing cut through the county's long memory of loss. National attention returned to Harlan as news of the violence spread. Journalists, labor organizers, and church groups arrived from across the country. Barbara Koppel, a young documentary filmmaker, embedded herself with the striking families. Her film, Harlan County, USA, captured the raw emotion and daily struggle of the miners and their wives. Scenes of funerals, picket line confrontations, and kitchen table strategy sessions revealed the human cost of the standoff. The documentary won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1977, bringing the story of Harlan's latest battle to a global audience. In late August 1974, after 13 months of turmoil and the loss of Lawrence Jones, Eastover Coal agreed to settle. The company recognized the United Mine Workers and reinstated strikers. The settlement ended the immediate conflict, but the scars of the Brookside strike, like those of the Harlan County War decades earlier, remained etched into the landscape and the memory of everyone who lived through it. The old pattern had repeated. Corporate power, worker resistance, and violence played out once more in the hills of southeastern Kentucky. Machines began to replace miners in Harlan County during the 1980s, setting off a chain reaction that would hollow out the community over the next generation. Continuous mining equipment, longwall systems, and automated loaders cut labor demand drastically. By June 2016, only 764 people still worked in Harlan's coal mines, a workforce smaller than any recorded since 1898. The population collapse followed close behind. Harlan County, once home to more than 71,000 residents, saw its numbers fall below 28,000 as families left in search of work that no longer existed. The 2008 financial crisis struck at a moment when the coal industry was already reeling. As the national economy contracted, demand for coal dropped further, forcing more mines to close. At the same time, new environmental regulations raised the cost of doing business. The Clean Air Act and stricter mine reclamation rules required expensive upgrades or outright shutdowns for older operations. Meanwhile, hydraulic fracturing unleashed a flood of cheap natural gas, undercutting coal's price in the nation's energy markets. Utilities, facing both economic and regulatory pressure, began retiring coal-fired plants at an accelerating rate. Each closure erased another market for Harlan's coal, compounding the losses. By 2016, coal employment in Kentucky as a whole had fallen to levels not seen in more than a century. The numbers tell the story: a workforce of thousands reduced to a few hundred, a county emptied by the slow grind of structural change. Harlan, once shaped by the relentless need for coal, now faced the consequences of dependence on a single industry that had in the end moved on without it. Harlan's present stands in stark contrast to its past. The city now counts just over 1,750 residents, a fraction of the boomtown it once was. Harlan County ranks among the highest 10% of U.S. counties for poverty. In 2014, per capita income reached only $27,425, while the national average stood at $48,112. Life expectancy here remains among the lowest in the country, 66.5 years for men and 73.1 for women. More than half of the county's total income now comes from federal transfer programs, including Social Security and food assistance. A testament to the lack of stable local employment, Harlan is a moist county, allowing limited alcohol sales in larger establishments, but maintaining restrictions elsewhere. The physical traces of the coal era are everywhere. Old company stores, their windows broken and walls overtaken by vines, sit empty along forgotten roads. Abandoned mine offices, once the administrative heart of the coal order, are slowly reclaimed by the forest, yet the memory of struggle persists. The song, "Which Side Are You On?" still echoes at union gatherings and local events, a reminder of the county's long tradition of resistance. Black Mountain at 4,145 feet continues to rise above the valley, a silent witness to the vanished coal empire. In the quiet of Harlan streets and the overgrown ruins, the endurance of its people remains, shaped by a history that refuses to disappear. Today, Harlan County's population has dropped below 27,000, less than a third of its 1940 peak. Median household income trails the national average by over 60%. The scars left by Sheriff J.H. Blair's deputies and the Brookside strike remain visible, etched into empty storefronts and fading union halls. The legacy of extraction isn't just history, it's the daily reality for communities still waiting for justice, renewal, or simply a future. Share your thoughts below.